boned-out caribou meat sitting on caribou antlers and grizzlies walking right through camp. She said, "This is it for me. I'm not coming back." So
it's a little too rowdy.
Well, she's definitely has a lot higher IQ than I do, because I knew I had to keep coming back.
I just remember you had an encyclopedic knowledge of everywhere we stopped. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's what happens if you do something.
If you stay around long enough.
Yeah. We can't get there by button heads and with extreme polarization.
Right.
That doesn't work.
Right.
Therefore, what can we do differently? The definition of insanity is to just keep doing what we're doing, button heads,
right,
and expecting results and getting nowhere. Well, that's what we keep doing. We can't keep doing that if we actually want to achieve something.
Right.
And what is it we want to achieve? So let's agree on that and then work backwards from that.
Hey, everybody. I wanted to remind all the listeners that the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers podcast and blast is sponsored by the Filson Company. And Filson's the original Alaskan outfitter. They've manufactured the toughest foul weather clothing and gear since 1897. When the job demands protection from thorny brush and wet weather, Filson's wax tin cloth performs like no other fabric. Filson also has the clothing and gear outdoors men and women need for backcountry excursions of any kind, or fishing alpine lakes or stalking bull elk. With opening day right around the corner, now is the time to visit filson.com and gear up for a great hunting season to come. Hey everybody, welcome back. It's Backcountry Hunters and Anglers podcast and blast. I'm Hal Herring, and I am here today with it's a podcast I've been trying to get for a couple of years, really, or so. We've been discussing with Bill Cunningham, who has been a guide, a wilderness guide all over Montana, Alaska, everywhere, right, Bill?
Yeah, well, those two places primarily.
Yeah, and then Bill has also probably got the longest, decades-long wilderness fighter advocacy. I guess of anybody I know, am I missing anybody?
Oh, I think there's
who's still out there kicking.
Oh, I'm sure there's a few that would put me to shame, and I hope they're around forever.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I've, like anything, you go around the track a few times and you begin to think you know something, and that's when you really realize that you really don't. There's just so much more out there.
Yeah.
But I've been privileged to be able to work on behalf of wilderness conservation for quite a long time. I suppose a good half century or so.
Yeah.
Which ain't bad for a guy that's only 39.
Yeah, I hear you. Who could even imagine the math?
That's right. We won't worry about the math.
Yeah. Well, yesterday, one of the conversations we had, you showed me that hike where we went up to Headquarters Pass and then took a traverse route that you had worked out over the years, which is really one of the most beautiful hikes, like local hikes for me, I've ever done. And then when we were up on top of that peak, you said, I really just don't know. I've done 200 trips in the Bob, right? Yep. Guided trips.
Yep.
And I just really don't know. There's places you'll never see if you live to be 10 times as old as you might as 39.
Yes, absolutely. I feel like I have not even scratched the surface on the Bob Marshall country. It's aptly been called the flagship of our nation's wilderness fleet. And
Gotcha.
It truly is.
Yeah.
It's look at it this way. You've got a wilderness core of 1.6 million acres. I think you could put about 3 Rhode Islands into that.
Yeah.
And that's the designated Big W under the 1964 Wilderness Act. And surrounding that is another roughly 800,000 acres of unallocated, unprotected roadless land.
Yeah.
Including the Badger 2 medicine that we should talk about here at some point. So basically, when we were on the edge of the Bob Marshall complex yesterday on that loop hike that you referred to, Hal, and I mentioned that I haven't even scratched the surface of knowing that country,
yeah.
And that's really true. There are places in there without trails. There's places that are dark, wild, and hidden, that have perhaps never seen a human footprint,
yeah.
and have never been visited by humans.
Yeah.
And I hope it stays that way forever. And that's a neat thought.
It is a mystery of it all. There's
a mystery to that country that should endure forever, because the whole idea of wilderness is to protect an enduring resource, to provide enduring protection. That's the key word in the 1964 Wilderness Act, is the word enduring. It's not transitory, it's not temporary, it's not something that we can just conveniently undo because maybe we'd like to put a road someplace or a ski hill or a logging show or a mine or something. No, it's to be protected forever.
Yeah.
You know, to the extent that we humans can put our mind around that idea of forever,
right.
but it's a permanent commitment. It's I think the most profound commitment that we humans can make toward a portion of the planet that we inhabit.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's an ethic there that I think. The United States was the first peoples to ever really think about this, and the '64 Wilderness Act and the energy around that, has always been. It showed me something about our country that I've always continued to say. When we're at our best, this is the kind of actions we do.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. It represents grassroots democracy. It represents the way the system should work politically. When the '64 Wilderness Act passed, it took 8 years, 8 long, tough years. It has probably the most extensive legislative history of any legislation Congress has ever passed, before or since. And it was absolutely bipartisan. And that's what we're missing now, is the extreme polarization and partisanship that surrounds wilderness and every other issue, it seems like, in American society. And but back in the day, 50 plus years ago, 60 years ago, during the debate that led up to the passage of the Wilderness Act, signed into law by President Johnson, it was absolutely bipartisan. We had solid Republican support, unwavering. And there were a lot of Teddy Roosevelt Republicans in those days. And that I thought represented the absolute best of our American democracy and the opportunities for citizens to really be involved in a substantive way about the decisions that are made about their public land. So the Wilderness Act is so profound in so many ways. You touched on it earlier, Hal, when you said it was a uniquely American invention, and it is, I think, the envy of the rest of the world. And it's been emulated to some extent in other countries like Canada,
where possible.
Some countries have even gone beyond the United States in terms of the amount of, or the percentage of their country protected. Costa Rica being an example of that.
Interesting.
So in America, we have maybe 4% of America in the wilderness system. An area slightly larger than if you combined it all into one chunk, it would be an area slightly larger than the state of California. That's a lot of territory. But consider that 150 years ago, it was all wilderness.
Right.
So we shrunk it down to the last 4%. With encroaching human development and industrialization and urbanization, all the different things that have resulted in the human footprint on the planet.
One of the things, if I don't know how much of this sound will be edited out, but one of the things about living where I do here, where we're recording this podcast, is that untold numbers of extremely loud motors go by my house, and then they come to that road turns into dirt way down there. And so most of them, I get to enjoy them as they coming back, where they realize they've lost the road. And so this might be one of the loudest places in Montana in a way. And it's close to some of the quietest country in the world, which I retreat to from my front yard and the fossil fuel engines that assail us from the early morning hours to the end of the night.
Well, that's an interesting irony, and it really is true. And of course, Augusta, where you live here and where we are now, Hal, it really is a remnant shred of the American West, of that mythic.
And it's loud.
And it's loud. It's a loud place because cowboys make noise.
Yep. And miners and like all that. I think of like all those steam whistles going off in the Old West, you know?
Yes. Motorcycle dudes now.
Now it's motorcycles.
And the guys in their big four-wheel drive pickups.
And the farm equipment going by.
Sure, farm equipment.
I mean...
no, it's not quiet. But the saving grace, as you pointed out, is that within minutes... You're into some of the finest wild country.
Yep.
Well, I'll say within an hour. You can be in the best of the best, and there's a lot of great wild country throughout the United States of America. But we are privileged to be in the shadow of the best of the best.
So
right
you
here.
saw. I want to go back to some of your history before we get too far. You were doing guidebooks and stuff like years and years ago, and I remember you were in the Death Valley. You have kind of a survey of some of the best in the West.
Well, I've tried to. There's a lot I've missed, of course, but my wife and I, Polly, we live up in Choteau, just 25 miles north of Augusta here. And we have written guidebooks, different parts of the West. We wrote a book called Wild Utah that was nothing more than an excuse to get out and explore country that we would never have seen otherwise. So we wrote about 45 different wildland complexes within Utah, and we were blown away by the majesty and by the diversity just within that one state, most of which is concentrated in the southern third of Utah, known as the Colorado Plateau. Yeah. So we spent a lot of time there. We spent a lot of time in Death Valley, Anza Borrego, Mojave, and Joshua Tree, 4 big wilderness desert parks in southeastern California. And again, even though California has 40 million people, it has the highest percentage of wilderness outside of Alaska of any state. Gotcha. It has 4 times the amount of wilderness as Montana does. Yeah. In a state that's roughly the same size and that has 40 times more people. Right. Wow. And that brings me up to a point, and that is wilderness can be defined in one word: politics. The politics in California, in blue state California, have been conducive toward protecting and passing significant wilderness legislation over the past 40 to 50 years. Yeah. And we enjoyed a short period of that situation politically in Montana when Mike Mansfield was our senior senator in Montana and also the Democratic Majority Leader for 24 years. Yeah. The longest serving ever in that position. And the junior senator of Montana, Lee Metcalf. Wow. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Yeah. Widely known as Montana's patron saint of wilderness. Right. And when he was a House member, he was one of the very first. He was the first Western congressman to put his name on the Wilderness Act as a sponsor in the House, and then he went on to the Senate. Yeah. And so I guess what I'm saying is that the political climate determines the amount of wilderness that's going to be protected, or the quality of that protection. It determines basically the feasibility of legislation. Do you think that the explosive nature of population growth in California also made people more cognizant that they needed untrammeled spaces? Yes, and I can speak to that from personal experience. I come from an old pioneer Montana family, but when I was very young, we moved to California. My dad went into business down in the San Joaquin Valley, and so I grew up in the south end of the Sierra Nevada. And back in those days, that would be like growing up today in Great Falls, Montana, and being fairly close to the Rocky Mountain front in a city of 70,000 people, which is about where I was. But I could escape and get into some of the best hunting and fishing I've ever had in my life when I was growing up. And then when I came of age to get to go to college. I came back to Montana to go to the University of Montana. So I had that sort of unique perspective on California getting overrun, more and more people coming in, the wild country getting a little harder to find, further back in. You had to go further. You couldn't find it close to the roadhead anymore. If you were going to have any quality experience, you had to make that much more effort.
Gotcha.
So coming up to Montana was like turning the page of history back in California, back to when I was a kid and way before then.
Yeah.
So I had that comparison as I grew up between California and Montana. Yeah. So your point, the huge population boom in California has definitely contributed to an awareness that, hey, we've got a finite resource here.
Right.
Like Will Rogers said, we're not making any more of it.
Right.
And we better damn sure protect it.
Yeah. So when you were, I think that's a critical part of your history as an advocate too, because I mean, I've told this story before, but I went to work at age 19 as a tree planter for the paper companies on contract, and I've just written about this. It didn't look like management. It wasn't anything. It was absolute devastation of the southern hardwood forest, which I had grown up in and been taught by my parents was one of the most beautiful creations of the Lord, And if there's any radicality, or if that's a word, if there's a radical side to my belief in protecting and conserving nature, it was born looking in those mass clear cuts.
Yeah.
And those chip mill operations that were going on barges down the Tin Tom, and then the replanting with monoculture loblolly pine for pulp. And so when I ended up in the West, I had something to compare it to. And I've never been anti-logging at all. No. But but at 19, when perhaps I most appreciated hunting and fishing in those woods, I got to see a wholesale, pretty much extirpation of it. It changes you forever.
Yeah, you did, and that left a permanent imprint in your mind.
Yeah.
And
I mean, the rivers were completely filled up with mud. And slash.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll never forget
Running black.
There's no, and like all it's better now than it was because the loblolly pines have stabilized it some. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it was a big deal.
It was a moonscape there for a while.
It was. We used to bid on stuff, and it was rolled, burned, sprayed, and chopped.
Yep.
And that's when you take these huge rollers, you take all the trees out, you spray it with arboricide, you burn it over, and then take a big roller behind a big dozer and roll it so that you have some purchase in the soil for the pines.
Wow. Well, that's a pretty heavy-handed approach. Put it mildly.
Yeah. So to go back, I don't know how old you really are, but where were you in 1960? I know you were in the Army in the late 60s. Where were you in 64 when they passed the Wilderness Act, and did you even know what that was?
Well, I sort of did. I was a forestry student at the University of Montana, and I was taking a recreation course from a guy named L.C. Merriam, who was well known in the field and had written a doctoral dissertation on the Bob Marshall Wilderness. In fact, his dissertation was, and this is before it was formally designated as wilderness.
Yeah.
But his dissertation was, would it pay to log the Bob? Or would it be so expensive that it would be better just to leave it alone?
Gotcha.
And he determined in his dissertation that, hey, it would be a money-losing proposition to go in there, to put the road network in, all the expenses associated with logging, and then to basically do timber mining.
Yep.
Timber mining, in other words, a non-renewable resource.
Because it's so cold and dry.
It gets cold, dry, high elevation, very slow growth rates, most of it east of the Continental Divide. Or much of it east of the Continental Divide, where moisture is even scarcer.
Yeah.
For tree growing conditions, and so you've got a situation where unless the taxpayer is willing to subsidize a below-cost timber sale, you better leave it alone.
Yeah. And remember the tie hackers back there?
I do.
Hadn't they taken out like untold thousands of acres of lodgepole at that point?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
For railroad ties.
Yeah, railroad ties for railroads through Augusta that never came.
Right.
And so, there was that going on. And that was up in the Sun River country. Yeah. Right through here. But, basically, in 1964, I was not politically involved. I was a student at the University of Montana.
Gotcha.
I knew vaguely about the debate on the Wilderness Act. I wasn't a party to it. I was learning a little bit about it. But what I knew way before then, Hal, is that where I was happiest in my life was when I was in wilderness. Mm-hmm. I didn't necessarily even call it that. And I certainly had no legal definition in my mind or any sense of land allocation that here's a process that we go to protect land.
But you had been in the growing up days. Y'all had a ranch in the Bitterroot on Lolo Creek.
My great grandparents settled there at the mouth of Lolo Creek in the 1880s. Okay, and that's where my grandmother grew up and where my dad grew up and so on.
The mouth being where the Lolo Creek goes in the Bitterroot River.
Yeah,
wow,
and then on up
that's
above,
a cool place.
And that actually, that original place, it was on my grandmother's side, so their name was Rock, and they had a dairy there, and they actually had the site of Traveler's Rest, arguably the most significant Lewis and Clark campsite, both coming and going. Yeah. On the entire Lewis and Clark Trail. Wow. And so Traveler's Rest is there. It's now a state park. Yep. None of that ranch, most of it's been subdivided. None of it's in the family anymore. There was an upper ranch on Mormon Creek below Lolo Peak, just south of Missoula. Yep. And that's where I caught my first fish at the age of 5 with a willow pole. Wow. And I was hooked at that point. No pun intended. Yeah. And so and then. God, my first elk was in that country. But by that time, I was a student at the University of Montana. I'd escaped the clutches of California and gotten back to God's country. Yeah, there's still a lot of God's country in California. I don't mean to slight that, but getting up where there were fewer people and more open space, wildlife, and wildland, that meant a lot to me. Yeah, and it's still the case here. Yeah.
Did you So I was thinking of California as God's country. Harold finally called us, my son.
Oh, yeah. He's working out of Bishop.
Yeah, but they were clear up into Alamy somewhere. They're packing hikers, dropping off hikers.
Oh, cool.
Kind of like what y'all did with Dropstone.
Sure.
Yeah. And he sounded the happiest. He said he was scenically, he said, I've never seen anything like it. He said he was saying how there wasn't enough wildlife and the weather was too benign and all that stuff. But yesterday he had a different tune.
Well, he got up in the high country.
He had seen Tuolumne and John Muir Trail.
The John Muir Trail. Yeah. Well, the Sierras are just absolutely incredible.
Yeah. And, there was a great change in the tone after that.
Well, and there's places in the Sierras where you can still find incredible solitude, and you can go for days and not see another human being. Yeah. Which is remarkable.
Given how close you are to so many of them.
To so many people. And Death Valley is the same way. That's one thing that really attracted me to Death Valley. Now, here's a park that's 3.5 million acres in size. That's 3 glacier national parks. Yeah. And because it is desert with very little water, an occasional spring, but very little water, you've got this. You've got vast expanses of backcountry that no one goes into. Yeah. Maybe a few of the canyons. There's a few popular hikes here and there. You'll see people. But if you want to do a serious backcountry trip and cache water along the way, which you would have to do, Death Valley is the place to go. And there you've got this incredible extreme between the lowest point at Badwater, the lowest point in North America, 282 feet below sea level. Wow. on up to Telescope Peak, which is right there in the Panamint Range, just immediately west of Badwater, and it soars up to 11,200 feet.
Wow.
So you've got 11,500 feet of vertical in just a few miles with snow up there.
Yeah.
You know, in the summertime, you
Do
might see
people
snow up
climb
there.
Telescope Peak?
Oh yeah. It's a great 12-mile round trip trail. There's a trail up there.
And you actually gain 11,000
No, not from the trailhead. You would gain maybe 7,000 feet.
Gotcha.
But
theoretically, you could go from the lowest point.
You could if you were really into self-abuse. And definitely go from Badwater to Telescope Peak. And I'm sure someone has done that because where else can you do that?
Right,
You know?
right.
So sure, someone's done that.
Wow.
I'm not sure I'd recommend it, but
I
can tell you're chomping at the bit. Hal.
Well, I've seen you do some things which would definitely be what do you call it? Mortification of the flesh.
Well, that's a kind way to put it. Thank you.
Running up that secondary peak yesterday was borderline, and in that wind.
Oh man, we were getting buffeted, and that was as an aside. We were within a recently designated addition to the Bob Marshall Wilderness.
Right, under the Heritage Act.
Under the 2014 Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Bill. And I might point out that because of the politics that have basically been the reality in Montana since the death of Lee Metcalf in 1978, we have not had, that was the first wilderness designation in Montana since 1983.
Well,
in 1983, in honor of Senator Metcalf, the Lee Metcalf Wilderness was designated. So we went from 83 to 2014, 31 years without 1 acre of wilderness being designated in Montana. Oh. That's a long wilderness drought.
Yep.
And so we broke the drought, not with a gully washer, but with a very light rain.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it wasn't any big deal. 61,000 acres added to the scapegoat in the Bob Marshall Wilderness and 5 small additions, including where we were yesterday. We call it the Our Lake Addition. And the loop that we did, I want to just, if I may, mention that I did not invent that loop. The loop was invented by Gene Sense, the godfather of the Rocky Mountain Front.
Yep.
The person who, more than any other living person, or any person who ever lived, I should say, has done more to protect the front than anyone else. And Gene is an inspiration to so many of us. And he's got a couple years on me, and I'll tell you what, there's no way I could keep up with him.
Remember I told you I finally got to hang around and talk. Gene's kind of a man of few words.
He is.
He
He's
will
a very
talk.
humble
And
guy.
He has incredible stories. He was telling me about being in Laos. In the 60s with USAID.
Yep.
And this is while we were standing in the wind up there skiing. But he's skiing at almost 80, right?
Yeah. He's within 6 months of 80.
Yeah. And climbing still climbing.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah,
he's. I was starting to say that the loop that we did, the centerpiece of that loop, the peak that you mentioned when we were getting buffeted by the high wind up on the front, we call that Sense Peak, and it's widely known as Sense Peak. It's maybe not officially known, but anyone that knows the front and that knows Gene Sense knows that Sense Peak is the center point of that crest of the Sawtooth Range between Headquarters Pass and Our Lake.
Yeah.
And so what you and I did yesterday, we did what I call the Sense Loop.
Yeah.
Hiking up to Headquarters Pass, where we had this great view of the Chinese Wall on the Continental Divide. 22 trail miles from where we were right there when we could see the wall. And we could see beyond another 30 miles to the Swan Range.
Right. You can also see Mount St. Nick and Glacier sticking up like a thumb. We can see St. Nick and Glacier.
Yeah. See the peaks of Glacier. We can see the Great Northern Peak, an extension of the Great Bear Wilderness, way up to the northwest of where we were. We could see wild country as far as we could see if we on a 180 from Rocky Mountain Peak, the highest point in the Bob Marshall wilderness directly south of us, sweeping around to the south, to the west, and to the northwest, and to the north, all wild country, all wilderness as far as we can see. But anyway, the loop was invented that we did yesterday, was invented by Gene, and in honor of him and his efforts to protect the front, we all call that mountain that you climbed just under 8,800 feet.
Yeah.
We call that Sense Peak.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's a remarkable. Also, it's an inobvious. There's a mountain goat trail. There's actual mountain goats that use it.
Yes.
But that trail does follow the obvious knife edge ridge that takes you up into the sky. You know, I mean, it's not a trail or nothing, but it does follow the obvious point, you know, not the path of least resistance because it's so steep.
Yes.
But it follows the obvious line into the sky, which is a wonderful thing.
It was an exhilarating hike.
Yeah.
I'm so glad we did that together. And you can just see so much. I mean, the wind is part of the country. It's just part of the experience.
Yeah.
And I've gotten knocked to the ground by wind. I've crawled out of some of these canyons because I couldn't stand upright.
Yeah. I was just thinking when you and I climbed Rocky, that it was one of the least windy times I've ever been in that country.
Yeah, that's
and
rare.
I didn't remember that until just now. That there was one day where there was an actual absence of wind.
There was an absence. That was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
You and I and Harold and Len Kopech from Augusta here made that climb. And, it was relatively calm.
Yeah.
But there's times when you literally would not physically be able to be there because you wouldn't dare get off the ground.
Right.
So you'd have to crawl over that scree and talus, all those sharp-pointed razor rocks that limestone that would just as soon cut you to ribbons as look at you.
Yeah, it was interesting to be on that limestone talus because I call it the frictional coefficient.
Yeah,
limestone is just really rough, right?
Yeah,
and so it holds together. If that had been granite shale, we couldn't have done that.
No, we'd have been slipping and sliding.
It had to be a pile of limestone scree to do that one.
Pretty stable.
Yeah, pretty
remarkably stable, even though
it looks bad.
It looks really bad, and there's crevices in there that if you slipped in there, you could break an ankle
for sure
in no time.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to be super careful, but the rock isn't sliding on you,
right? Because,
like you say, it's that friction.
It's the friction,
and just almost like it's mortared together, a lot of that stuff.
Right.
But once in a while, you get a ringer. You got to be careful.
Yeah, for sure.
And it'll slide. So you got to be careful.
Yeah. Did you you ever been down to Rattler Gulch, that rock climbing area down by Drummond?
Oh yeah.
It has a talus field like that looks impassable, but you get on it, it doesn't move because it's just pure limestone.
Mm-hmm. Same stuff.
Yeah, same stuff.
Same stuff. Madison limestone. Mm-hmm. We've got about 3,000 feet of thickness of that up here on the front.
Gotcha.
And it's it's basically there's caves that have never been explored. There's a lot of hidden places up there. The limestone serves as kind of a buttress too.
Yeah. So to change its terrain a little bit, you spent a long time, you and your son, guiding backpackers in the Brooks Range as well.
Yes.
And can you tell me how did you come up with that idea?
Well, I came up with the idea about 20, I guess it's been 21 years ago now. I took my first caribou hunt up in the Brooks Range.
Okay.
And my wife and I flew in. She wasn't hunting. She was just going in for the trip. And so we flew in 150 miles northwest of Bettles, across the gates of the Arctic National Park, across the Arrogance Peaks, the Alatna, across the Naigu, all that incredible country. And I was absolutely blown away by the size, by the majesty of it. And so we got in there, landed, we were on a Beaver airplane, de Havilland Beaver, and landed at a lake, and I witnessed wolves, grizzly bears. We saw lots of caribou, had a great hunt. The fishing was good in the lake that we were at.
What was in there?
northern pike and Arctic char.
Gotcha.
Got them both. So we were feeding on tenderloin from caribou and fillets from Arctic char.
Wow.
About as good as it gets.
Yeah.
So I was hooked. It was,
Yeah.
I knew that I couldn't let a year go by without getting back there again.
Yeah.
And so Polly and I did 3 successive trips. And finally, with grizzly bears coming through camp and with meat bags of boned out caribou meat sitting on caribou antlers and grizzlies walking right through camp, she said, "This is it for me. I'm not coming back." So
It's a little too rowdy.
well, she's definitely has a lot higher IQ than I do, because I knew I had to keep coming back.
Yeah.
So, but how in the heck can I do that unless I can figure out a way to at least break even on it? Because it is spendy.
Yeah.
To the bush plane and the non-resident tag fees
Yep.
and so on, which incidentally about 3 years ago doubled from what they had been for 20 plus years before. So now a caribou tag non-resident is $650. It was
Wow.
$3 1/4 then.
Yep. I bought one.
You bought one at $3 1/4.
Yep.
And then the following year, after your Adigan trip, Hal,
Yeah.
it doubled in price.
Gotcha.
And the hunting license.
We could only afford one for the two of us back then.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and then at the same time, that caribou herd, the Western Arctic caribou herd, which at that time was 500,000, began a natural decline. I'd say almost like a plummet. Could have been a result of a lot of factors, including climate change, but nonetheless, that herd is down to well under half of what it was when we were hunting in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
So in the early 2000s, getting back to that, I had been outfitting and guiding here in Montana for many years up to that point, ever since 1973.
Gotcha.
So I already had been at it for 25 plus years, but I began to think, if we ought to just start guiding up here. And so we were able to get a permit from the Park Service in Gates of the Arctic National Park. And we began running 2 week long, an August trip, 2 weeks long, so that I could get up here, run a trip, and then stay there for a subsequent caribou hunt.
Gotcha.
Which is what I did every year from 2003 through until 2014.
What kind of people signed up for? So this was backpack guiding.
The backpack guiding.
No horses.
No horses. Sometimes we would do a combo river trip. Mm-hmm. So we would have rafts, inflatable rafts flown in to a predetermined point, backpack to that point, pick up our rafts and the resupply of grub, and continue on a river.
Gotcha.
But usually there were straight backpacking trips from one float plain lake to another float plain lake. We would travel an average of about 6 miles a day, which doesn't seem like much, but it's off trail. It might be in tussock, which is the hardest hiking and terrain, vegetation type overland experience you can possibly imagine. It's very difficult. So we would design a trip that might be 50 miles with some layover days for peak climbing or relaxing or fishing, whatever, and exploring. And so we did a number of these traverses, a dozen or so, that was different every time.
Gotcha.
And I just began to develop a huge respect and reverence for that country. The park itself is 8.5 million acres without any infrastructure, without any human infrastructure.
Yeah.
And
so, what park are we talking about?
Gates of the Arctic National Park.
Yeah.
So it's 4 times the size of Yellowstone, 8 times the size of Glacier National Park.
Wow.
Without any infrastructure. And so talk about not scratching the surface.
Yeah. Did you get hammered by weather ever?
Oh, man. One thing about August, we would go up in August. Well, actually, my ulterior motive was to dovetail with the late August caribou hunt. Mm-hmm. So that fit nicely. But also, come usually by the 10th of August up in that country, the bugs are down. There's been a frost. And otherwise in July, it can be totally untenable.
Gotcha.
With mosquitoes and gnats and white socks and you name it. I mean, just really the whole menagerie of insects that plague caribou to the point of driving them insane.
Right.
We've been pretty successful for the most part, not 100%, because there's always going to be some bugs, but it's manageable.
Yeah.
And so by going up in August, you sort of take care of most of the bug problem, but August is the monsoon of that country.
Uh-huh.
And so you're going to get rain. You might get a spell of beautiful, crystal clear weather for a week, and then a rainstorm will come in, or it could rain every day. And we've had everyday rain.
Yeah.
And it just becomes part of it. You just it's raining. Okay.
You just live in your rain gear.
Yeah. You live in your rain gear. Yeah. You keep moving. There'll be occasional times when it lifts, but we've had snow. We've had wind blow down tents. We've had every weather event you can imagine, up to the point of actual winter. I mean, we've never experienced what you call hard winter because we've always been done before the end of August.
Yeah. Did when you're in that, there's no firewood, right?
Yeah, there is. Surprisingly enough, you won't find a tree, but you'll find woody stems, willow and mainly willow stems.
Yeah.
If you had to, you can get a fire going. We've always just used the little propane stoves, but we have been able to get fires occasionally. Would carry a shelter for community gathering and cooking, and to keep it away from where we sleep, and would carry bear canisters and bear spray. And we've always seen a lot of bears every trip, a lot of grizzlies. Never had any issue with them.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, I was amazed with that. That like you're
we would use the triangle system for setting up camp, and that is you got your tent site, you've got your food cache, and then you've got you've got your cooking area. So you keep those three things separate.
Yep. How far?
50 to 100 yards.
Yeah, because that's
should be adequate.
A few years ago,
try to keep it in line of sight if you can.
Right. So we did some trips in Glacier, and it's been 10 years ago or so. But we used that triangle every time. You see bears every day.
Yes.
The bears see you. You know, there's where it's like a mutual observation going on,
well,
and so
that's the key.
You just really don't want to be in calling them in.
Absolutely, that's the key. No surprises.
Yeah.
So they see you, you see them. Everything's cool.
Yeah.
And frankly, my experience with grizzlies is that they want less to do with you than you do with them.
Yeah.
And there's something, I mean, we humans must really stink because, my God, when they catch a whiff of us, they are gone.
Yeah, I just witnessed that on that last trip. You know, we would watch them. They would pick up their heads. They'd check the wind as soon as we moved down, upwind.
Yeah.
And then they just hustled. You know, but that is in an area where they, probably they encounter armed people a lot too, because it's elk hunting country.
That's the thing. It's hunting country. Yeah. And I think that's one good thing about hunting where there is hunting permitted in grizzly country.
Yeah.
And actually, for years, Gates of the Arctic National Park, there is subsistence hunting.
Yeah.
Among natives, and I've never witnessed that. And there is sport hunting in adjacent preserves that are set up under the Alaskan Lands Act to allow sport hunting on the edges of some of these national parks. Gates of the Arctic is an example.
Yeah.
On the north end and on the south end. We've hunted sheep up in the north end.
I was going to say,
caribou.
You made quite a few big sheep hunts up there, right?
Yeah. Well, I've only made 2 sheep hunts. I've been on some sheep hunts with others, but the thing about sheep hunting is Alaska law requires you either to hire a guide, which is very expensive, but it's important to support that guiding industry up there. So I don't begrudge that one bit. But there is another aspect of that regulation, and that is that if you've got kin that's an Alaska resident, as a non-resident, you can hunt with that person.
Okay.
Be it your son-in-law, your son, your uncle, your nephew, whatever. It's got to be, I forget what, by second or third kinship.
Yeah.
But if you hunt with that person, then you can hunt sheep.
Gotcha.
Without a guide. Excuse me.
So, did y'all get any? Have you ever killed one? Yeah.
Nope. Had great hunts.
Yeah. That's a huge adventure.
It's an adventure,
Yeah.
and just great. We had one case where we were pulling a stalk on 3 rams, one of which was legal, had to be full curl.
Mm-hmm.
It was a legal ram, and it was a layup. It was a slam dunk kind of deal, and we were working into it, and then along comes a grizzly bear, and that grizzly spooked those rams. They went the other way, and the grizzly just went right between us and the rams, and. I figured, okay, that's why they call it hunting.
Yeah. Wow. Well, when I'm trying to know, this podcast is going to yo-yo back and forth hard between past and future and all that, but that's okay. I was,
oh yeah.
You missed Vietnam because you were sent to Fort Leonard Wood in Kansas, right?
Yeah.
Or Germany, or
I was a combat engineer. Which is what foresters often become when they go in the Army.
I got you. Didn't know that.
So some of my forestry background was useful that way. And so we were in Germany, and then orders for Nam, came home to Missoula to do some annual leave before heading to Vietnam, and then got diverted at the last minute. The war was starting to wind down, and maybe in my particular MOS, I think my particular rank in MOS was in surplus. At that moment in time, I lucked out because we had 5-week-old twin baby boys that had, and my wife was obviously concerned, and I was ready to go. But when I didn't have to go, that was good. We went to Leonard Wood, finished out a year of military service there, and then I got back to Montana.
Gotcha.
And was on the faculty initially at the university.
Gotcha. Did you go? You've actually done beyond like all the hunting and fishing and guiding. You've worked as an advocate.
Yes.
For years, for as long as I've known about you before I met you.
Yeah, that goes back. That goes back a ways, Hal.
What led you to that? Out of the family that you were in?
Well, the family that I was in, my dad was orphaned here in Montana and was totally self-made, had to pull himself up but with nothing, and became a successful businessman, had a business in Missoula. And he was a conservationist without ever using that word.
Gotcha.
Didn't need to.
Yeah.
And that's where my ethic for hunting and fishing was developed with my dad. Down in California growing up, and then back in Montana. And so we did a lot of that together. I guess my advocacy for conservation develops fairly slowly, though, through college, through graduate school. I did a master's project on the Magruder Corridor controversy.
Gotcha.
And I was absolutely intrigued by the people that I met, people like Doris Milner of Hamilton, G.M. Brandborg, the famous...
Stuart Brandborg?
Stuart Brandborg's father. And
wow.
G.M. Brandborg was supervisor of the Bitterroot National Forest from 1935 to 1955. And for the next 20 years until his death in 75, he made life miserable for the Forest Service because he was fighting them every step of the way.
Well, that was during the Boley Report?
That was the Boley Report, the clear-cutting controversy.
Yeah, give us a little bit of... So I know Magruder Corridor because I've spent a huge amount of time there in all those years in the Bitterroot.
Yeah.
But that corridor goes from around Darby back to the Sellway.
Yeah, basically it's from Nez Perce Pass going into Idaho, down the upper Sellway, down Paradise and so on, all the way down the Sellway River. And originally, It was part of an original wilderness that was administratively classified back in the 30s. It was part of, there was the Salmon River Breaks country to the north, and there was the Sellway country to the south. And anyway, the Magruder Corridor was about 370,000 acres, all of it in Idaho, from the Montana boundary going west down the Sellway. And it was in between the Sellway Wilderness to the north and what is now known as the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness to the south. Okay, so it's right between, strategically located, right in the heart of that country, between these two great wildernesses. And in 1963, before the passage of the Wilderness Act, the Secretary of Agriculture declassified the protection of the Magruder Corridor.
Okay.
It was administrative wilderness, and with the signing of a pen, signed an order, the Secretary's order, declassifying the protection of that area so it could be opened up for roads and logging.
Okay.
And that's extremely erodible country.
Steep.
The timber resource is marginal at best, but it's world-class hunting and fishing country, wildlife habitat, watershed. The Upper Sellway is just majestic. It's magical. And as I say, strategically located between, in the heart of these two great wildernesses that we have. And so in 1964, to fight these plans, some folks in the Bitterroot, led by Guy Brandborg, J.M. Brandborg, and Doris Milner, formed the Save the Upper Sellway Committee. Okay. Grassroots citizens that were determined to fight the Forest Service and prevent the development plans from occurring, to protect the Upper Sellway. And without
the road would come from the Bitterroot.
Yes,
and still does. Yeah,
it still does. The road was already there.
Right.
So the road, and that's the Darby to Elk City Road.
Gotcha.
And dirt road, gravel road, all the way. That road was there. No one questioned that. But the country on both sides was protected as wilderness. Gotcha. And to the south would go to the River of No Return, and to the north would go to the Sellway Bitterroot. And so that was that set in motion a classic grassroots controvery involving the timber industry, the Forest Service, and the citizens. And Guy Brandborg played such a key role because he had been the supervisor of the Bitterroot for all that time. Well, and which extended into Idaho.
So he knew how things worked.
Oh, he knew exactly how it worked. And so he played a key role and never let... He basically was putting the pressure on Doris to in turn keep putting the pressure on the Forest Service. And there were many other people involved from Idaho and Montana. But suffice it to say that it took 16 years, but in 1980, all that country was reinstated as wilderness as part of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. Gotcha. And so that was a 16-year battle. Yeah. I wrote my thesis in the late 60s, so it was ongoing. Gotcha. But
and your thesis topic was this battle?
The Magruder Corridor controversy.
Wow. I didn't know that either.
And so doing a Master of Science in Forestry on basically a social science kind of issue was groundbreaking. That had never been done before. Yeah. So I had people like K. Ross Toole on my committee. Well, famous Montana historian. Yep. And I had an excellent committee. Arnold Boley. Yep.
I was going to ask you if he was there then.
Yeah, he was there. And then I finished my thesis, and then I went in the service, came back, and was on the faculty for a year or so, and then went to Helena to work for the Department of Natural Resources, which I did for a few years. But during that time, I was
the state DNR.
State DNR
Gotcha.
in Helena.
Yeah.
And that was an exciting time too in Montana because of the controversy over Coal Strip 3 and 4,
Yep.
and the new laws relating to stream protection, coal mine reclamation.
Yep.
The Water Use Act, all
What
that
years
stuff
is
was
this?
happening. This was in, and then the the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, where we got
1971 to 73.
That's when we got the right to a clean and healthful environment
That's
for
right.
Montana.
Constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment
Unbelievable.
in our state constitution. And I worked during the Con, I was on the faculty in Missoula, and I was moonlighting over in Helena, lobbying on the Constitution relative to the public trust doctrine, trying to get the public trust doctrine embedded into the Constitution.
Okay.
And
would you explain what the public trust doctrine is?
Basically, that the land and water and earth that we all rely on is part of a public trust,
Sure.
and that when the management are the trustees, and we're the beneficiaries of that trust, and so it sets a higher standard of care, of stewardship to publicly owned resources like public land, for example. And it's there's a lot more to it than that, but just very simplistically. But a spin-off of that was the constitutional right to a clean and healthful environment. Bob Campbell was the architect. He was a delegate to the Constitution, and he was the architect of that.
Wow.
And so a lot of us worked on that. And then, I continued to work in state government during the legislative session in 72 to 73 that really brought many of these laws that we now are still benefiting from in Montana. The Montana Environmental Policy Act, for example, patterned after NEPA. Mm-hmm. So MEPA patterned after NEPA.
Okay.
And by George Darrow, a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
So even at that point, 40 years ago, we still had some good, solid bipartisan support for environmental protection and conservation.
As we talked about yesterday, I think we're going to come back to that over the next 10 years. The jury is still out.
Yes.
But it has been so extreme, the break between so-called conservatism or Republicans and the environment and all that stuff has been so extreme. I think we're moving away from it. This is what I hope. Hey, this is Hal Herring, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers Podcast and Blast. Thanks for being here. Thanks for joining us. They asked me to call out for membership, looking for new members, looking for people that want to join up, have a good time, and fight for America's public lands. This is a good time to do it. It's $35 a year. For that, you get a $25 t-shirt. You can check that out, backcountryhunters.org/BHA podcast. Backcountryhunters.org/BHA podcast will show you what we got, what we're offering. And part of that is beyond a t-shirt, you get a subscription to Backcountry Journal, which is one of the better magazines coming out on hunting and fishing on public lands in America right now. It's beautiful writing, beautiful photos. And partially also you can see that membership at BHA is part of a powerful movement that's necessary, but it's also part of having a really good time with people like mine. Go to backcountryhunters.org/BHA podcast. Check it out and join us if you can. We're going to have a good time, and we have been having a good time, and we're going to have a lot more of it. Come on in. See ya.
Well, let me continue.
Yeah, keep going.
Well, just a little bit, because I want to get to what finally made me break loose of working for an agency and being able to be more of an advocate, working for environmental advocacy. And my inspiration in doing that came from Phil Tawney, one of my heroes. And of course, the late Phil Tawney is the father of Land Tawney, the head of BHA.
Right. Yeah.
And so Land certainly has it in his blood to be doing the good work that he's doing.
It's funny because I was talking to Land just day before yesterday, before me and you went on that hike, and I said, well, I got to get Cunningham on the podcast, while he's in town. And I couldn't. He told me some of that history.
Yeah. Well, Phil and I were close friends and compatriots, and working on issues of mutual concern. And I had been working for Montana DNR. Phil was heading up the Environmental Information Center, which he had co-founded. He and Robin Taney had co-founded MEIC with Don Aldrich, who was head of the Montana Wildlife Federation. And Phil was fixing to head to Ann Arbor, Michigan to do a master's in natural resources.
Okay.
And leaving Montana, and he talked me into pulling the plug on state government. And here I had a young family with giving up job security to do what I really wanted to do. And so we were able to raise a little bit of seed money, and I quit my state job. That was kind of scary.
I bet.
And I quit my state job and went to work for MEIC. That was in about 1975.
And how old was MEIC at that point?
3 years old.
Gotcha.
So it was embryonic.
Did Phil Toney found that?
Yes.
Oh, I had no idea.
Phil was the founder, the co-founder.
Yeah.
They had been over at lobbying and working in the legislature on wildlife and wildland issues, environmental conservation issues. And with Don Aldrich, one of the deans of Montana Conservation.
And Tim Aldrich is his son.
Exactly.
Good Lord.
Yep. And so
doing these podcasts is incredible because we would have never gotten to this, me and you talking.
Yeah.
I would have never learned this.
Never would have come up otherwise.
Yeah.
So Don Aldrich and Phil and Robin Taney founded MEIC to come up with a voice for the citizens of Montana to lobby in the legislature and to monitor state agencies. And I put together, we put together a grant proposal, got it funded, where I was supposed to help monitor state agencies in terms of their compliance with these brand new environmental laws that no one was sure at that time. How are they going to work, and are they going to work, and who's going to make sure they're implemented properly? And so, at any rate, we were overseeing the agencies and lobbying in the legislature, which is, of course, is biennial. So I did that, but my real interest, and that was really exciting work, and I don't regret it a bit. I will confess to not having stayed with it very long, because a guy named Cliff Merritt came to me after about 6 months and said, "Bill, I'd like you to be the Montana rep for the Wilderness Society." Cliff had founded the field program for the Wilderness Society, a native Montanan, grew up in the Helena Valley on a ranch, and 25 years older than me, and just a absolute pillar of the wilderness movement. He was a guy who was instrumental, certainly, in the passage of the Wilderness Act itself.
Yeah.
I came later.
Yeah.
And so Cliff dangled this idea of a Montana rep job in front of me, and I just could not resist it. And he had other reps in place.
Yeah.
People like Dave Foreman, founder of Earth First, who was the New Mexico. Dave was at that time the New Mexico rep. Yeah. And people like Bart Kohler, who you might know. He was the Wyoming rep at that time. Yeah. And so on. So I was joining an amazing group of field reps, and so I just jumped into it with all fours and became very much involved in two major issues at that time. And Cliff gave me my marching orders. He says, do everything you can to help Lee Metcalf pass the Upper Missouri Wild and Scenic Rivers Bill and Lee Metcalf's Montana Wilderness Study Act that had 1 million acres, 10 national forest roadless areas that would be congressionally designated for wilderness study and have indefinite interim protection as wilderness until Congress came up with a decision on them. And again, long story short, but with the help of a lot of people, the following year, in 1976, we were able to blast Lee Metcalf's Missouri River bill through
Yeah.
in an omnibus bill. And
What part of the Missouri River was that?
it was the 149 miles of the Missouri from Fort Benton down to the Fred Robinson Bridge on the CMR.
Yeah.
That whole stretch, 149 miles.
Gotcha. How many times have you done
Cliffs,
that? How many times have you done that stretch? On
At least 100 times.
Yeah. I mean,
Well,
I know you're an
actually-
early pack rafter but last time we did that, you were in that pack raft, which seemed too slow to me. But it worked great.
Yeah, I kept up with you guys, didn't I? More or less.
You were asleep a lot out there.
I was. That's because I was drinking too much beer.
Yeah, that was an awesome trip.
It was awesome. 2 years ago.
You've done that like 100 times?
Well, different segments. 30 times alone for a 30-year period with the late Dan Hines on a mule deer hunt that we would do down through the wildest and most rugged part of the Missouri Breaks from the Judith River on down.
Gotcha.
And that's below where we were. The trip that you and I did with Chandra Brown and the others 2 years ago, that was the White Cliffs from Coalbanks Landing down to the Judith, 47 miles.
Right.
We would do the remaining 63 miles or segments thereof every fall.
Right.
And do it by canoe and sometimes get froze out. I mean, the stories I could tell.
I remember one of those stories where y'all were like, didn't the river go completely solid?
Completely solid.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was. Yeah. That was. I think that was 1991. It was the year of the perfect storm. Remember the book written about the perfect storm, and all hell was breaking loose on the northeast coast.
Right.
Well, that same system was coming through here, and we had on Halloween, the end of October.
Yep.
It was 30 below zero, and the river froze solid.
Yep.
So, yeah, that was quite a hunting trip.
Right. I was in the Bitterroot then, and it wasn't near as extreme on the west side.
No.
I remember that was one of the Halloweens where it was below zero.
It was way below zero.
But it was not as the Bitterroot, the west side of the divide was not as extreme. Y'all were in the epicenter.
Yeah, we were.
Yeah,
we had a knack for that.
Yeah.
So some of those 100 trips, and maybe it's 90, maybe it's I don't know exactly the number.
I just remember you had an encyclopedic knowledge of everywhere we stopped. Yeah.
Well, I guess that's what happens if you do something often.
If you stay around long enough.
Yeah.
And pay attention. Yeah.
Well, paying attention, I'm not real good at that, but unless it's wild country, then I perk up.
But so y'all, that was wild and scenic designation in 76.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yep. In 1976, and it did not at that time protect anything beyond the corridor itself. So, but in that same year, 1976, Congress passed FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act.
You bet.
Otherwise known as the BLM Organic Act.
Yep.
And that law included a provision to designate wilderness study areas on the BLM. And I might mention that in 1964, the BLM, which administers more public land than all the other federal agencies combined, was completely left out of the Wilderness Act. It was like, well, that's just flat prairie. That can't be wilderness. People were thinking of wilderness as being peaks, pikas, and pointed firs.
Gotcha.
And so the Forest Service, the National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service that administers wildlife refuges was specifically included in the original 64 Act. BLM wasn't even thought of.
Yeah.
It seems incredible, doesn't it?
Yep.
So that was rectified 12 years later in 76 with the passage of FLPMA.
Gotcha.
And the WSA process was highly contentious, as you'd expect. Ranchers with permittees, or with grazing permits, I should say, the permittees were extremely hostile to this notion of wilderness, even though the Wilderness Act specifically grandfathers grazing where it existed at the time of designation.
Right.
Livestock grazing not only may continue, the Act says shall continue.
Right.
In other words, the agency cannot phase out grazing because of wilderness designation. The grazing, livestock grazing shall continue under the terms of the Wilderness
Could it, though,
Act.
make your life really difficult as far as getting in there with a truck and trailer?
Well, there was a provision for that in the Colorado Wilderness Bill in the committee report language. And I was back in D.C. working on that with Andy Wiesner and some other people on the committee staff to make sure that where there's a real need to get equipment in to, say, dig out a
stock tank or whatever.
Stock pond or whatever, that could be done with equipment.
Gotcha.
And so it would be one of these things that wouldn't be done often because it doesn't need to be done often.
Right.
But yes, equipment would be able to use for the necessary administration of the grazing permit.
Okay.
So that's clear. Those guidelines are still adhered to and are recognized by the agencies.
Yeah. Partly
because they've been forced to recognize them. There has been litigation. There's been challenges on that, but and it's worked both ways. But basically, wilderness in of itself should not be a reason to oppose. Or grazing should not be a reason to oppose wilderness. There may be other reasons.
Right.
But grazing is a grandfathered use.
Gotcha.
So, but it was still very strongly opposed by the livestock industry and by livestock producers. We work closely with them, and in the Missouri breaks, we work closely with them. They didn't want one single acre designated. We wanted a lot more places like the Bullwhacker that were left out. But the WSA process in the Missouri breaks, down below the Judith, did result in the designation of 6 wilderness study areas that extend deep into the breaks and far beyond the river itself. And those 6 WSAs, portions of only 2 of them have been formally recommended by BLM for wilderness, but all, and that's Cow Creek and Antelope Creek, but all 6, Woodhawk, Stafford, Irvin Ridge, they're spectacular places.
I bet,
Creek.
yeah, there's a lot of that I hadn't seen.
Oh my gosh, it's talk about wild country.
Yeah,
you can go in the middle of the Bob Marshall and see all kinds of people. You can go deep into the Missouri breaks, and I tell you what, that is the definition of solitude. Yeah. It is wild country.
I was there's Kid Curry's hideout in there when that.
Yeah, that's up in the head of Antelope Creek.
Yeah, and I've still that's on the list.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a neat place to visit.
Yeah.
And you can get to it from the upper end.
Yeah. Years ago, and I can't remember where this is, but it's south of Glasgow. There's a cottonwood log post office in one of those. And it's of course, been long abandoned. But it was actually a post office during homestead days and before Fort Peck was filled. And it's in one of those coulees.
Yeah.
And somebody took me there. There's a bunch of abandoned farm equipment from like 1900, and then this post office. And I couldn't. This is kind of the beauty of this. Why I'm telling this.
Yeah.
Is I cannot figure out where that was.
And
the person who showed it to me is gone.
That was meant to be.
Yep.
let it remain a secret.
One time
who knows,
shot.
Hal? Maybe you'll blunder across it.
Maybe
someday.
I'll blunder across it someday.
Yeah. Just my gosh, I've been here
there
before.
It is.
I recognize that.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the neat thing about floating the Missouri breaks. Glenn Monahan wrote a great book about the history of the Upper Missouri, of the Missouri breaks, with the history of the homesteads and the old buildings you come across, and that's a great thing.
Who did that?
Glenn Monahan.
Okay.
And out of Anaconda, but he's an outfitter on the river. Runs guided trips on the Missouri.
Yeah.
And Glenn's the real deal. He's been fighting for the cottonwoods. His big issue, and I think it's well documented, is that hot season grazing is something you do not need in cottonwood groves.
Right. Well, they're trying to get those cottonwoods back after years of right.
Well, you know, with the dams upstream, you don't get the flooding necessary for cottonwood regeneration, and so you combine that with hot season grazing, where the little upshoots are just clipped right off.
Right.
You're not going to have recruitment of cottonwood.
Right.
It's that simple. And the old stands are dying off and getting cut down by beavers.
And you can see that they're single aged. Even on that 43 mile trip we did.
Yes.
You can see that it's even aged. There's no, and I guess as an aside in here, I did that trip from Fort Peck to Williston, on the river, and it is so unstable where those cottonwoods are gone.
Wow.
Like it's just dropping off into, and filling up and shallowing up. So then the water temperature is higher, evaporation's more. This is such an ecological or a systemic
It
thing
all
we're talking
interconnects,
about.
and-
It's totally connected. Yeah.
And were you fishing down through there?
No, we did a map. It was a job I took. It was they were mapping that river. And I'll tell you about it sometime. It was a great trip. It's about almost a month.
Wow. Well, when I hear you talking about that, I can't help but think of the James Willard Schultz book, Floating the Missouri.
There you go, buddy.
And there it was in 1906, of course, long before Fort Peck.
Yep.
Which was built in the 30s. So long before that country was flooded, and the incredible time that they had with his Native American wife.
Yep. And that David Byers, who made the film Public Trust, he told me that what most impressed him about that book was that everywhere that James Willard Schultz and his wife stopped, they had a story about somebody trying to kill them. Right?
That's right.
Like 30 or 40 years before they saw that like a band of I can't remember what native tribe it was, but they were like, oh no, right away if the fight in his time there as a younger man, when you encountered somebody, it was like 70-30 that the fight was on.
Yeah.
It was a corridor of conflict and people they were hunting and like traveling but it was also just really wild west world.
Really intense competition.
Really intense.
So if you're in from a competing tribe, you were the enemy.
Yep, it was on.
You just go for it.
And that's what David said. He said, I was just blown away by their recollection. The book is short.
Yeah.
And their recollections are, this was the place where we almost got nailed by, and this is the place where we fought,
Yeah.
It's a great story.
Oh, man, gosh.
I've been on a binge of his. I got The Sun God's Children.
Oh, good.
I got My Life as an Indian, all of this stuff. And in that binge, I found a book by George Bird Grinnell that I'd never heard of before called Cheyenne Campfires.
I had not heard of that.
Grinnell's time with the Cheyenne at the elders were still back to the raiding and buffalo culture, and he hung out and listened to them and wrote it down.
Wow.
It's really good.
Oh, man, that's on the ever-growing list.
Yeah. And I think that one I was just in a bale of books, But yeah, so that the protection of that corridor so that people can do what we did.
Yep.
It's just one of the greatest things we've ever accomplished.
Well, it's an important issue for backcountry hunters and anglers because that corridor that is currently in the Wild and Scenic River System and surrounded by wilderness study areas is the only place I know where if you've got the gumption to do it, you can take an extended multi-day flat water canoe hunt. You can spend a week, you can spend 10 days, you can spend 3 days, whatever time you have, and you can hunt wild country, and you can do it the way Lewis and Clark would have done it.
Yep.
And I don't know where else you can do that.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, we have not been successful in banning motors, or at least getting a no-wake rule during the hunting season. But at some point, we need to advance that agenda. Because there isn't any other opportunity for that. I mean, folks that
you lived through the transition too. I remember we talked about this about 6 years ago.
We did,
but you had lived through a time where it was just canoes, and then lived and then did the trip so many times that you ended up being assailed with jet boats. That's
what's happened.
Right.
When we first started doing that trip, we'd see a few more float parties, with canoes or maybe even an occasional raft, and never see a motor.
Yeah.
Once in a while, see maybe a local guy with his little 10 horsepower putt rowboat, and he'd go down to his fishing hole.
Right.
And and fish a little bit during the fall, and it would sometimes see the same old guy there. He's probably out of Big Sandy or somewhere.
Yeah.
Can't remember. And that was fine. That didn't bother us any. But then the evolution of jet boats and
which, by the way, I love. I'm saving up to buy another one on that.
I see that. Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things too is I was completely blown away because when my kids were small, we had numerous flat tires and burned out a tranny on the road from Big Sandy to Judas Landing in that gumbo. And it's now like a jetway paved all the way down. And when we did that trip, I had no idea. I was like going, well, we should budget like 45 minutes at least, for just to get through that road. And everybody said they had nobody had any idea what I was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you can go 55 mile an hour.
Oh, easily or more.
Yeah. And that was when my kids were little, that was a long piece of gumbo gravel. Yeah.
Well, and there's one or two places especially bad for gumbo along that route.
Yeah.
And now it's a high-speed highway.
Yeah. So things change.
So things change, usually not for the better.
Well, this brings us to this conversation we had during the break, and it's conservatism, freedom, change.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that relative to wilderness. And I spent a lot of time working with lots of folks in an effort to try to safeguard what is a rapidly diminishing resource, the resource of wilderness. And that is, first of all, we have labels for things: conservative, liberal, and Republican, Democrat, and so on. If we want to talk about true conservatism, the most conservative form of land use there is wilderness. There's nothing more conservative than that. Mm-hmm. What we're saying is, okay, people, it's time to back off and show some humility and some respect. And those are the hallmarks of this incredible commitment by society. It's a societal decision, the idea of setting aside land as wilderness. It takes an act. It takes a legislative act. It's an act of society to come about the process that eventually involves the designation and protection of land as wilderness. And the hallmarks are humility and respect. We respect the land. We respect the processes that shape the land. And it takes a lot of humility to be able to say that, because humans all too often like to think of themselves as being at the top of the pyramid. But with wilderness, we're saying, no, we're not at the top of this pyramid. We have this magnificent pyramid called the Bob Marshall Wilderness, or the Sellway Wilderness, or the Everglades Wilderness, or the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness, or the John Muir Wilderness, whatever, across the country. And we are not at the top of that pyramid. We are, in fact, not even supposed to live there, because we're visitors who do not remain. And so this profound act of humility and respect, I think, really brings out the very best in human nature. But it also raises the question, what is true conservatism? Right now, if you were to try to determine the partisan weight for and against wilderness, unfortunately, you'd find within the Republican Party overwhelming opposition to wilderness. The Republicans are the so-called conservatives, right? And you'd find within the Democratic Party the support for wilderness.
Right.
And
for now,
I'm talking about now, not the way it used to be.
Right. Or maybe
or I hope in the future it'll be different.
I hope it'll be different because, and this is a very contentious topic, and we won't go too far into it for another day. But I do not think that what we see as liberal America now is going to be overly concerned with wilderness in the next 20 years. And I think that we had better create a larger vessel to hold those hopes and those realities of wilderness protection and environmental protection, because I don't see if you poll the voters who vote whichever, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, libertarian.
Yeah.
Libertarians may be off on the side, but they're not actually going to get what they want.
No.
And so if you poll them, the environment doesn't come up like I'd like it to.
No. The only exception to that, and we're going to see huge changes here, is climate change.
Yeah.
That is a total game changer for the planet, for the country, for humanity, for all life forms, all of nature.
Right.
And so what we're going to find out is that as the years go by, as the clock ever diminishes the amount of time remaining to actually do something that's going to make a big difference, that's going to make the difference, that you're going to find climate change not only a household word, but something that won't make any difference what your political persuasion is. You're going to be concerned about it. It's going to be part of the conversation.
Right.
And it's going to be, okay, my kids are growing up into this, and I might be gone, but what about my grandkids?
Right.
And so you're going to find, I think the game changer is going to be climate change. Mm-hmm. And it'll be all pervasive, and it'll be the umbrella over every single thing, everything else.
I wish that the game changer could be building ecological and societal resilience in the face of an inevitable change that we're already embarked on.
Right.
That's my thing. So you would have, if we're not going to build, if we're not going to designate and create more prairie wilderness, we would create something on public land in the prairies which recognize a prioritization of ecological services.
Right.
Native grass,
right.
The address of noxious weeds like cheat, Medusa head, rush skeleton weed. Sure. So from the beginning, I've never been a climate science denier, but I've always been sad that climate, which seems to be very abstract to most people and very difficult to address.
That's the problem right there.
Yep. It has sucked the energy out of the environmental room. And all I wanted was a Waters of the U.S. Act to go into Congress and have everybody fight about it and pass something like that. Mm-hmm. I wanted floodplain recognition to address the dead zone down in the Gulf.
Right.
And instead of talking about those, we got bashed by climate change, it's coming. It's going to kill us all. And I think people honestly stopped worrying about floodplains and noxious weeds and ecological resiliency.
Well, that's exactly
and
the
more
concern.
And wilderness, which would be a great reservoir of rubber.
Well, you're right on, and I think that there's going to be a growing recognition that we can't deal with climate change unless we have the resiliency for all of the environment and all the pieces that fit together. Unless we have that,
right,
then all we're doing with climate change is rhetoric.
Right.
We're not really doing anything. We're not moving toward a carbon-free economy.
Right.
Which, in terms of job creation, I can't imagine a more lucrative and productive avenue to take.
I think it would be a economic explosion.
Oh, absolutely, as opposed to mining an increasingly finite resource that's killing us.
Right. Even
with more and more carbon.
Yeah. I mean, somebody said a long time ago that if your economy depends on you digging something up and setting it on fire, you probably need to be thinking in a different box.
That's it.
And it's not that didn't work really well for a long time.
Oh yeah.
That's arguable, but
Well, and we all know that we're hooked on fossil fuel for the foreseeable future.
Right.
What we have to do is begin working to the substitutes to make up that gap.
Right.
And that has to come online.
And Daniel Yergin, who's the petro historian,
mm-hmm.
he said the third great engine that we haven't touched, the third great source, is efficiency.
Yeah.
And he said we have been awash in fossil fuels to the point that we didn't need a better ball bearing or a better this or a better that.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And there's talk about economic explosion and innovation.
Oh,
and meritocracy. Who wins the $1 billion prize? You know?
Exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly right. That's what we're talking about with respect to air travel.
Right.
And so, in other words, how can we fly more efficiently on a per capita basis to reduce the carbon footprint? And,
Gotcha.
And major strides are being made there.
Yeah.
Of course, the COVID pandemic has reduced air travel significantly.
Yeah, it definitely hit a pause button.
Oh, man.
When you were, one of the things I want to go back to, and when you were talking about the fight over the Magruder Corridor, and all of that, things, split of 1976, which basically, the Sagebrush Rebellion, as far as my research goes, really dates back to 1976 in Flipma.
Yeah, that was the genesis of it. And then with the election of Reagan in 1980, and when Ronald Reagan said, "I'm a rebel, count me in as a sagebrush rebel."
As a sagebrush rebel.
And I'm from the government. I'm here to help you.
Right.
You know, that sort of
the
thing.
most dangerous words in the American language.
Yeah.
Even though,
right.
like, I mean, at that time, government was helping everybody. I mean, it just
that set in motion what we're talking about right now.
He fed those flames like nobody else.
Right.
And
that's right.
I've always questioned, Jim Range, who founded TRCP, Teddy Roosevelt. He was really good friends with Reagan. He loved him. And I had lots of conversations with Jim about that. And he one of the things he loved about Reagan was his sincerity. And and Jim said that was absolutely real. And so I just I have a hard time reconciling all of that with the rhetoric that came out that at the time, having a smaller, more efficient government, I get it. Okay, I'm in,
Yeah.
But the fanning of those flames was, I think it was unnecessary. But
it's
who knows?
really interesting. I for a very brief time, I knew Ansel Adams before he died, the famous photographer, and he was on the Wilderness Society Council when I was still working for that organization. And Ansel told me a story about how Reagan had read somewhere that he was not liked by Ansel Adams. And Reagan couldn't imagine anyone not liking him.
Right.
I mean, super likable guy, right?
That's as I understand it. He really
super likable guy. How could anyone not like me?
Yeah.
He actually set up a meeting in the White House for Ansel to sit down and visit with him. How come you don't like me?
Yeah. And it was over the environment stuff.
Sure, of course it was. And how could, Mr. President, how could you appoint someone like James Watt, who is totally insensitive to the environment, to be overseeing the Department of Interior, for example? Just, I mean, how these things don't add up, Mr. President. We know you're a nice guy. You're a great guy. You mean well.
Yeah.
We know you're sincere.
Yeah.
And I don't think Ansel Adams ever questioned that, but there was a disconnect, just like the disconnect you're talking about here.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned Arnold Boley earlier, but one of the things that was happening in the 1970s that was why we had Flipma, and why the Boley report came out in the 80s, right?
Let's see, when? No, it was before then.
Okay.
It was in the late 70s. In fact, it led directly to the National Forest Management Act.
Yep.
And I'm trying to remember, was that 1976 as well?
So what I wanted to get across to people who probably weren't born then.
It would have been in the mid 70s, I think.
Gotcha. So what, like I was 8 years old, but what I wanted to get across to people was in the Bitterroot where Boley was studying, he was a professor at U of M, right?
He was the dean of the forestry school. Dean of the forestry. Yeah.
Okay, there was the clear cutting was so extreme. They were using those terracing equipment, where they literally reconfigured the face of the mountain to in an attempt to stop erosion on stuff that probably should never have been logged in the first place.
Oh, absolutely right. It was the terracing and the massive clear cuts, hundreds of acres in size, on really steep slopes. 40-50% slopes, and so that's what raised the alarm. And there were two national forests that were used as the poster child for reform of national forest management: the Monongahela. Okay, is that in West Virginia? I think
it's and Pennsylvania too.
Okay, the Monongahela and the Bitterroot were the two star examples of malpractice. So you had an eastern forest, a western forest, and then the Boley Senator Metcalf commissioned Dean Boley and faculty members to come up. They call it a select Committee on Forest Practices on the Bitterroot National Forest.
Yeah.
And they came up with a set of recommendations, and they came up with the term timber mining. This wasn't, you think of forestry as a renewable type of land management, right? You're renewing the forest, cutting it down, replanting, reseeding, and so you have some concept of sustainability.
Right.
But the way it was being malpracticed on the Bitterroot, it was mining. It wasn't forestry.
Yeah.
And so
it's fascinating that it was Monongahela National Forest too, because that was the site of all that terrific flooding.
Yes.
That ended up, I think, in Pittsburgh. It was a colossal disaster.
Wow.
And it was based on slicking it off back in the pre-1900 days.
Wow. So it just exacerbated everything.
And it's funny that now you forget over a course of 1 century, as to why this public land existed in the first place.
Incredible.
Yeah, that in the Bitterroot, I don't know when this happened, but I remember this has been in my time. The Overwitch disaster. Yeah. Remember when that whole hillside collapsed into the West Fork of the Bitterroot? I do. Yeah, the East Fork of the Bitterroot. Sorry.
No, that's the West Fork.
Was it?
Yeah.
But that Overwitch country was incredible mule deer country.
Oh boy.
At one time, and that whole thing turned loose and just fell in the river. It colored the river all the way to Missoula.
I remember that. Yeah, well, it's if there's anything that's good that comes from these kinds of catastrophic human accelerated or human caused events, it's reform.
Right.
More public awareness.
This is what I was getting at.
And reform. Let's get with it, people. And so we passed the National Forest Management Act. Yeah. Of 1976, the same year that we passed FLIP. I'm pretty sure it was 76.
Gotcha.
So the Boley Report came out. Lee Metcalf was still around. He died in early 78. And so, and Lee Metcalf had commissioned Dean Boley and the University of Montana School of Forestry faculty members to put together this report, which was really groundbreaking. I mean, it changed the equation. Yeah. It had a huge impact.
And he was an unimpeachable source, too.
He was.
He was the dean of the forestry program. He believed in logging. He believed in management.
He did. Yeah. And he was also a hardcore wilderness supporter. Yeah. In other words, he had a completely well-rounded perspective on public land management.
Gotcha.
And very well respected. In fact, when he passed away in I want to say about the time Phil Tawney did, a little before, about 1991, and Phil passed. No, 93, I think. Yeah, it was 93, and Phil passed in 95. Anyway, Dean Boley was referred to as our nation's most distinguished forester.
Wow.
And indeed he was.
Gotcha.
And so just tremendously well respected.
Yeah.
And I had a chance to work, I had the opportunity to work very closely with him on a number of different fronts.
Yeah.
He was not only the dean when I was on the faculty, he was the dean when I was in the forestry school. I took my first forestry course with him as a freshman. Introduction to Forestry. He taught that to the young first year forestry students. Yeah. And just an inspirational guy, and very, very well respected. So that led to groundbreaking, breaking new ground. That was Gifford Pinchot's famous book about starting the Forest Service.
Gotcha.
Breaking new ground.
I don't know that one either.
Yeah, Breaking New Ground by Gifford Pinchot.
Gotcha.
Who was Teddy Roosevelt's chief of the Forest Service.
Yep.
And he and Theodore Roosevelt, of course, were very tight, very close.
Yeah.
And so, coming back to the present time, my evolution of advocacy sort of worked into the public lands arena. We were able to get the Montana Wilderness Study Act, Lee Metcalf's really important legislation passed only 2 months before he passed away, but he was around to see that happen. And then upon his death, in great tribute to him, his Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness Bill was rammed right through the Senate, despite opposition from then Senator John Melcher, who was basically not helpful at all.
That was Montana Senator.
Yeah, Montana Senator. He was, at that time, Melcher was the junior senator. Metcalf was the senior senator. Metcalf died in January of 78. And by March of 78, the Lee Metcalf's nearly 1 million acre Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness Bill was signed into law.
Wow.
And Jimmy Carter was president then, signed it into law. And then later that year, we got the Great Bear Wilderness, which, again, was near and dear to Metcalf's heart as the connecting link, a major connecting link between Glacier and the Bob Marshall.
Right.
So the Great Bear, named after the grizzly, the monarch of that country.
So when you go, I've never been in that country at all. When you go into the Great Bear, where do you go from on the west side?
A popular place that is to go up from Bear Creek, which is right where the Middle Fork makes a big turn and hits Highway 2.
Okay.
And then Bear Creek comes on down from the divide, and so you got the Middle Fork forming that southern boundary
the Middle Fork
of Glacier.
of the.
So you can head up the Middle Fork and be immediately
Middle Fork of the Flathead.
I'm sorry, the Middle Fork of the Flathead.
Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
Gotcha.
So that's a really popular place. There's other entryways that would get you up further north, up closer to Great Northern Peak. There's some dead end trails that go into some of the lakes just right off Highway 2.
Yeah.
Like Stanton Lake, for example.
Yeah.
There's ways of going in from the Badger Two Medicine, from the South Fork of the Two Medicine, over the Continental Divide at Elk Calf Mountain, and to get into some of that country. Actually,
Wow.
A good way is to go up the Challenge Creek and the Puzzle Creek complex of roads and then some trailheads that lead you straight down into the Middle Fork, down to Granite Park.
Gotcha.
Down Morrison Creek, down Lodgepole Creek.
We did a job in Puzzle
Okay,
Creek.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so I have been in it. I have seen it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
you've been down there.
Yeah. Wow.
So the Middle Fork Flathead has always been known as the Big River. And for example, it heads up in Big River Meadows just off the Continental Divide, and then down and then gathers more tributaries, and around Gooseberry Park becomes a major river.
Yeah. One of the things, I know we got about 15 minutes and we'll wrap up, but you just kind of been in the burning heart of this. Like,
it was an interesting time, Hal, because it was just happenstance and dumb luck. But I happened to be on the job both in D.C. for the Wilderness Society and in Montana as the Montana rep during the last time of Lee Metcalf's life, who was spearheading so much of this wilderness legislation. And it was also during the Carter administration. And it was during a time where there was tremendous excitement and momentum behind the wilderness movement, and that will come in other forms again, and even now I think we're seeing resurgence in some places.
Yep.
So but at that time it was especially a good time to just be there and to be part of it, a small part of it. Like I say, lots of good people like Arnie Boley and many others.
Did you live in D.C.?
I lived in D.C. for a year. I took a year off in 1977, the last year of Lee's life and the first year of the Carter administration. And it was a time when the Democrats had control of both the House, the Senate, and the White House. And it was really the beginning, I would say, of the partisanship on wilderness and public lands.
Yeah.
So that you could count on the Democrats to or at least higher a level of reliability, that the Democrats would carry the ball for conservation.
Gotcha.
And the opposition would come from Republicans, and it was party line right down the line.
Yeah.
We had, at that time in Montana, we had 2 congressional districts. We had a Republican in the Eastern District, Ron Marlonay, We had a Democrat in the Western District that at that time was Max Baucus, who later became U.S. Senator.
Right.
And this was before Pat Williams had come on board for 9 terms.
Baucus was such a profound moderate. Even, I was around during some of that.
He was definitely cautious, had his finger to the wind, dancing on a hot griddle most of the time. He was very cautious. We had one innovation that we came up with. When I say we, the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club back in D.C. came up with an idea that I think was the original brainchild of Doug Scott, and that was what we called the Endangered American Wilderness Bill.
Okay. And
it contained areas in 12 different states, including Montana. We had 3 areas in Montana that were included: the McGregor-Thompson, Mount Henry, that was also in the Metcalf Study Bill, and Welcome Creek.
Down in the Sapphires.
Down in the Sapphire Mountains, about 40 miles southeast of Missoula.
You bet.
And so these 3 areas, only one survived in the final cut, but we did pass that bill in 1978. And it contained the Welcome Creek Wilderness, small heart-shaped wilderness, the drainage of Welcome Creek and surrounding tributaries of about 28 or 9,000 acres, quite small, but strategic in terms of Rock Creek and the Sapphire.
The headwaters of Rock Creek.
Yes, it's one of the headwaters of Rock Creek.
Yeah, you bet. Now, we did a Trout Unlimited and Field and Stream piece once where we fished. I was with Land, Tony.
Ah, cool.
And it's really a long time ago. We fished Rock Creek, and it was so obvious that the headwaters, Rock Creek gets a lot of use.
Oh, yes.
I mean, it just, and yet.
We saw that last week, and it's good, though.
Oh, it is, and people love it,
They love it.
and it is such a powerful, river, really.
It's a river.
It's a river, and its headwaters in those protected forests is the engine.
There's some big chunks of wild roadless country, like Quig Mountain, the Sapphire Wilderness Study Area, one of the original Metcalf Wilderness Study Areas that, thank God, is still in WSA status, despite efforts by Senator Daines and Representative Gianforte to declassify all of them.
Right. We had this discussion the other day about Senator Daines' desire to quote unquote air quote release the wilderness study areas, and the truth is I don't know if you might not agree with me, but some of them might be great to not be wilderness study areas or whatever, right? But to blanket that.
Yeah.
And to have a one-size-fits-all release of these things when you've got stuff like the Blue Joint down by Painted Rocks Lake.
One. Blue Joint.
Overwitch is another one, the headwaters of Overwitch.
But let's talk about Blue Joint for just a moment. One of the original Metcalf study areas, again, 63,000 acres, and it's actually contiguous and a part of the Frank Church River of No Return.
Right.
Connects right on there.
Gotcha.
And so it's a logical addition. It's not like it's a separate area hanging out of nowhere.
Right, out on an island.
Yeah,
right.
And even the Sapphires. You think of the Sapphire Wilderness Study Area, the head of Moose Creek. There was a timber sale plan there that got Doris Milner and others charged up to protect that area and to get that into the Metcalf bill for study.
Yeah.
And that area... and trying to remember the exact acreage, I think about 116,000 acres.
Where is that?
It's from Scalco Hole Pass south along the Sapphire Divide all the way to the Anaconda-Pentler Wilderness area, connecting onto the Continental Divide right there.
Oh, yeah.
And so the point I was going to make is that rather than to look at a place like that in isolation, it's actually part of a larger contiguous wildland, which I call the Sapphire Anaconda-Pentler Complex.
Gotcha.
Because it's contiguous to and connects to the AP.
This is some serious elk hunting and mule deer country, too.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Mountain goats, elk, you name it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's incredible country.
Yeah. I had a strange experience in that Blue Joint country after we were kind of commercial morel picking.
Oh, wow.
Through there, and I was by myself, and I'd hiked in. It was burned really hard, 2,000 fires.
Yep.
And there was this creek there, and it was just in the ash, like just mud and ash. And this creek was running. and I hiked down in there. And there wasn't any really morels, and I was just going cross country. And in a pool there was no vegetation, there was no wood, there was nothing. It was just ash,
Yeah.
And in a pool there was some, I don't know, 2 or 3 pretty good size, like 10-inch, 12-inch cutthroats, just holding on.
Holding on.
They
Wow.
had made it. They had made it through kind of like a nuclear destruction of that fire. That fire was so big and hot,
That's incredible. You
And-
talk about resilience.
Oh, you talk about they define resilience.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And you were talking earlier how we need more human resilience
Yep.
to deal with environmental challenges. And
Yep.
indeed we do. But boy, we humans could sure learn a lot from the natural world
Yep.
if we're smart enough to hold on to it.
You bet. And I was just, I've never forgotten that. That image is in my mind forever. They're going to make it.
Yep, they're going to make it.
2 years later, all that was fireweed and and thousands of lodge poles exploding everywhere.
Oh yeah,
and those
dog
fish.
hair lodgepole coming
Yeah.
in from the serotinous cones.
Yeah,
from
but
the
that was
fire.
some beautiful country there.
Oh, it's really beautiful country. Anyway, the Montana Wilderness Study Act by Senator Metcalf did become law shortly before his death. Then we got other legislation passed in '78. The Absaroka Beartooth, the Great Bear, the Endangered American Wilderness Bill. But during that year in 1977, one point I wanted to make sure I mentioned.
Okay.
And that is Phil Tawney and I job shared. And I had agreed to go back to D.C. for a year. Very reluctantly. I hated like hell leaving Montana, but I went back, rented an apartment, made frequent trips. I felt like a congressman going back and forth. And Phil held down the fort magnificently here in Montana.
In Helena.
In Helena, working on wilderness legislation and building grassroots support while I worked at the D.C. angle.
Yeah.
And we made a hell of a team. But what was really interesting, and it shows the dedication of Phil, is that we job shared one pitiful salary. Each of us allegedly working half time. Both of us with young families.
Wow.
Young kids.
Yeah.
And this is back in 1977. My boys were 6 years old.
Yeah.
And Phil's were younger. Land may have been just about born then. I don't know. He was
Probably
pretty
not.
young.
Yeah.
Very, very young.
Yeah.
And so we did this. And when I came back in '78, marginally victorious with the help of a lot of people in terms of having passed some important legislation, Phil and I continued to do that work.
Yeah.
For a period of time, and I forget the exact sequence, but I did want to make the point that I mentioned earlier. That Phil is really one of my heroes, and I think of him every day.
Well. Yeah, well, his legacy is pretty well. It's going forward
incredible.
pretty good.
And
yeah,
it's still going on, and certainly Land's leadership of BHA is testimony to that.
Yeah, I was amazed when you were giving me all these names. And their sons carried on a lot. I was thinking of all of these people. I recognized the last name, from actor.
And guess what? They're related.
Yeah, and so is the passion for it.
So is the passion. One thing
go ahead.
I was just wanted to make one comment, because we've alluded on this back and forth and lamenting the intense partisanship and polarization and how it used to be bipartisan in terms of wilderness and conservation and it isn't right now. One thing that I think is especially pertinent to hunters and anglers that love the backcountry, that seek out the backcountry. My understanding is that roughly 2/3 of people who call themselves hunters vote Republican.
Yes. I think that would be my understanding. And I could say just anecdotally, I think that's probably true.
Yeah, and I think that is true. And I think probably, I don't know how that breaks down with BHA, because BHA has more of the non-motorized hunting community and people more interested in backcountry hunting experiences.
But you and I talked about yesterday, like by many, many measures, I'm a gun nut and a gun writer and a gun person. You're a gun guy. By most measures, we would be termed conservatives.
Right.
And I think that, and being out in the backcountry, being in Alaska and the Brooks Range, I mean, the self-sufficiency required for all that really pulls people like you and me away from a so-called nanny state party.
Exactly.
You know,
exactly.
So, I don't want to interrupt you. I want you to keep going, but I have a question for you at some point.
Okay. Well, the only point is that wilderness is tantamount to freedom.
Yes.
It's self-reliance.
Agreed.
It's the American character. It exemplifies everything that is great about our country, and it's freedom.
Yep.
And I think if you talk to the average Republican voter who's concerned about issues like freedom, personal freedom, and resistant to government, suspicious of government, maybe even anti-government, but at least keep the government off my back.
Right.
Their concern is personal freedom, but the epitome, and yet the Republican Party is completely dead set against wilderness. Okay, well let's try to reconcile that. We can't, because wilderness is freedom. That's the definition of wilderness.
Right.
And so I maximize my personal freedom when I'm in wild country. I am most free. I am most happy. I am most self-willed. I am most independent. I am most self-reliant when I'm in wilderness. And to take that away from me, to say that, no, let's put a road here so that we can overrun it with motors, to do that sort of thing is a direct infringement and confiscation of my personal freedom.
Yeah.
And so
I got it. I mean, I'm right there with you on that.
And so why would a person who loves the outdoors, who's out there hunting, who's experiencing firsthand wild nature in the pursuit of wild game, why would that person then vote for a party that is inimical to that freedom,
right,
that is doing everything it can to destroy that freedom?
I'll answer that, because they can't. And I am not too far from this. You can't imagine voting for another party which you feel is worse. So how do we?
But how is it worse? I mean, again, we're talking about public lands, wild land. Where it's already public land. It's already managed by a public agency. So we're not changing that, right? It's already public land.
Right. Let's say that I'm a diehard Republican. And I'm a backcountry hunter and a angler and I love to take my horses elk hunting every year.
Yeah.
In the Bob Marshall or the Frank Church or whatever, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's say I'm a Republican. So what should I do? I'm not going to change my political affiliation.
Right.
I'm using this as a hypothetical.
Yeah.
I can't stand Democrats. I've never liked them. I don't like liberals. I don't like nanny states. I don't like federal overreach. Don't even really like the government, but I understand we have to have one.
And I damn sure don't like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer.
Hate them. Can't stand it. So then what shall I do?
Okay. I think I'll just start asking some hard questions. And that is, first of all, I would examine my own motivations on what it is I'm really after when I seek some type of backcountry experience. When I load the horses up and get out, what is it I'm looking for? I'm looking for a certain quality, right? There's a quality out there that you're not going to find in the middle of a clear cut, or in the middle of an open pit mine, or in a heavily roaded, densely roaded area where there's no game because there's nothing but road hunters everywhere.
Right.
So you start asking these questions, and then you might say, okay, there's some problems here, because one man's freedom can be another man's tyranny, and so my freedom is getting into the backcountry with my pack stock on a hunting trip or a fishing trip or just a backcountry roaming trip.
Okay,
that's my freedom. I love doing it. But how can I reconcile that with how I vote? And, there's no easy answer to that, because I understand the animosity against the government being a symbol of confiscation of freedom.
Right.
So I guess
This is an incredible conversation too. I wish we could do a whole nother.
oh gosh, yeah. Well, maybe we can.
Well, you remember yesterday? So we were talking coming back down the mountain. It's like you have to understand. You have to face this. You can have total anarchy,
Right.
and devil take the hindmost.
Yep.
And you can have a intense type of libertarian system, which I would argue that some like Mexico and Somalia sort of have, although they have kind of a kleptocracy going on there too.
They have that but it's anarchy.
There is anarchy down below.
Oh yeah.
So devil take the hindmost for sure. So you can have these things, but if you're going to have a government, if you're not going to have any government at all, you're not going to have clean water. Because people are not going to agree to pay extra not to dump their trash and stuff in the water.
Yep.
They're not going to do that. You're not going to have public lands because somebody's going to lay claim to as much land as they possibly can.
There could not be public land. If you're
without a government, there is no public land.
If you're an extreme libertarian, then you don't believe in public ownership, really, of hardly anything.
Right.
Maybe national defense.
Right.
Maybe,
there is a libertarian like creed or something, but it doesn't include having public lands.
No, it does not. No, you privatize public land if you're of the libertarian persuasion.
Right.
It's a fascinating discussion, Hal, because it gets into the inconsistencies that we all have on our value system.
Exactly.
And I'm as subject to that as anyone.
Yep.
So I'm into freedom. I'm into personal freedom.
Personal responsibility.
And personal accountability and self-reliance, personal responsibility. If I screw up, I want to be held responsible.
Right.
I don't want to shift the blame to anyone else.
Right.
I think we have someone in the White House that could maybe learn that lesson.
Right. It's never going to learn it, though, I don't think.
No, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But Harry Truman said the buck stops here.
Right.
And so we'll have a president someday where that'll be the case,
right.
And America will be stronger and better off for it. But right now, in the interim, we have a situation where we're all dealing with inconsistencies and a certain level of hypocrisy, and I'd be the first to admit that I'm as guilty of that as anyone.
Right.
So you go to your core beliefs. And the core belief, or let me put it another way, you go to your core objectives that you would like to see for you and your family and your community. You want clean air, you want clean water, you want wide open spaces, you want abundant wildlife and suitable habitat to sustain the wildlife. You want outdoor recreation opportunities that are free and available for any citizen that is responsible and that treats that resource with respect. So you want all these things. Okay, well, who can best provide them? Which party is on the cutting line to make sure that happens? Which party is maybe a little less inclined and maybe more interested in privatizing?
Right.
So you have to look at it there, and then you weigh that against the basic distrust you might have for government, the basic dislike you have for East Coast interference over what is our country here.
Okay.
The territoriality. There's nothing wrong with territoriality. We all have it.
Yep.
During COVID, I've seen scads of people coming in. They're buying up chunks of Montana as fast as they can, sight unseen. We're seeing more people coming through here. They're COVID refugees from other more heavily infected parts of the country, and they're fleeing.
Yep.
And
I've watched the rise of territoriality amongst people who would never recognize, very liberal people that I know, who would never recognize it. It's a tribalism. They're like, I don't know why they have to come here.
Yeah.
And it's like another of these inconsistencies, right? Like
exactly.
Like we have to own those.
Yeah, and and so the ownership is really important too. I mean, if you're invested in something, if you have ownership in something, I mean, just taking it as an example on wilderness, the wilderness battles that we've been successful with over the years have been those that have been led by people that are intimately connected to that place,
Right.
to the place that they revere and that they'll fight to the death for. And that's what's really neat about the process set in motion by the Wilderness Act of 64,
Right.
is it's total grassroots democracy. It took the power to designate wilderness away from the agency,
Right.
and it said to the Forest Service and to the Park Service and so on, mainly the Forest Service, you can no longer designate wilderness. It's up to the people, it's up to Congress and the people.
Yep. That's a very powerful thing.
It's very powerful.
Yeah.
But it's the double-edged sword of wilderness. One side of the sword is, hey, we got permanent protection. It's enduring, the key word in the Wilderness Act.
Right.
To secure for this and future generations an enduring resource of wilderness. That's the key objective.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the other side of the sword?
You're not going to get very much of it.
It's damn hard to get it. You bet, because it takes an act of Congress.
Right.
And right now, Congress is totally dysfunctional.
Right.
And because of the extreme polarization.
Right.
So what we need is to break that polarization down, so that Republican-leaning voters can vote Republican, and at the same time be voting for a Republican that's going to fight for public lands.
This is what I think is going to happen.
Did.
This is what I think is going to happen. That right there.
We need a strong, viable two-party system.
Yep.
It can't be lopsided. I don't want to see nothing but Democrats. Believe me.
Yep.
That's dangerous.
You can't. It's dangerous, right? And what I wrote in this last piece I worked on, it was breaking my brain because it was this question. And the answer is, say, the 25 nay votes on the Great American Outdoors Act.
In the Senate.
Yes, in the Senate. There's 81 Republican yes votes in the House. It's big.
That's pretty big.
Just big. But what it is was the nay voters did not really change their stripes ever. They're against almost everything.
Yeah. They're against everything.
Yeah, and
they're
so
antis.
They're just antis. There is no what do you want?
They're absolute obstructionists.
Yes, and they've made a good career out of that.
They're exactly what they label environmentalists as being. Obstructionists.
Yep.
But that's what they are.
Right.
There's nothing they're in favor of.
Right. So so what I said though was, and I hope that I want this to be true, is that those kinds of politicians, the scorned, the ideologically constipated, the people just can't get it. They're going to be in the rearview mirror of America, not of a political party. Not of it's I'm going to vote for the Goombo party. Nobody's going to be doing this. If it's against clean water and cleaning up the dead zone and trying to fix fisheries in the Gulf, you're just going to be all by yourself having your meetings, as they used to say, in the phone booth. You know?
Yeah.
This is what I think, because it's too dangerous for us, anybody, to place all of our environmental hopes in any one party, especially with if the Democrats are the only thing carrying the water for wilderness, I don't think we're going to make it.
We're not going to make it.
No.
Absolutely will not make it.
Yeah. And
when we had that brief interlude that I referred to back in the mid to late 70s, when the Democrats had the White House and the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
And we had some really good people then.
Yeah.
People like Lee Metcalf, people like Mo Udall.
Yeah.
In the House, but even then, to try to save wilderness was like swimming upstream against a very stiff current.
Right.
We had much stronger opposition in those days from the timber industry, which was much stronger then, and the motorized lobby. Motorized recreation lobby was just getting started, but they were powerful even then. I bet. Surprisingly so.
Well, they represent a lot of money. Like if I'm buying dirt bikes,
yeah,
I'm facilitating economic churn.
Absolutely. Or snowmobiles.
Yeah.
And snowmobiles were as big a deal then as, in some respects, even a bigger deal then than now, because I think people are developing more interest in backcountry skiing and ski touring and
for sure.
and doing things away from machines more so.
But like I told you with my friend in Wyoming who I just did the big trip with, he is essentially a dirt bike snowmobile guy. Now he's a wilderness fanatic.
You can be both.
You can be both. He's it, and he's young, 27. I would love him to be in this conversation.
Oh boy,
because
I would too.
He's not really a bomb thrower. He's pretty rational, based, reality based. But he's good. He'd be good in this, and I think he's the future because he's both. He's both.
Well,
and passionate about both.
And that's what it's going to take. Yeah. We have got to have true conservatism, and by true conservatism, I don't mean the hypocrisy we see in the Republican Party.
Right.
And I don't mean a lot of the things that, frankly, I don't like about the Democratic Party.
Right.
I'm talking about true conservatism, and that is just right down to the earth, solid consistency with your values, and I think when as we evolve toward that, and you're saying maybe in a 10-year time frame we might.
Well, you've just seen this COVID explosion of people out in the outdoors.
Yeah,
it's incredible. It's incredible. The river, the Yellowstone fishing access sites are packed. And the Yellowstone is only clean. It's only the way it is because it didn't get dammed up.
That's right.
And it's increasingly got pollution problems in Lower Yellowstone. They're bad. And they've had, 2 oil spills in the last decade. But people love that river.
Yes.
And that river, with no government, there wouldn't be a land and water conservation fund that bought the fishing access site.
Yep.
And they wouldn't be able to swim in it. Because you can't swim in it in Mumbai.
No. Oh, God,
no. And it's just like, we have to figure this out.
We've got to figure it out because all of us are carrying our load of inconsistency and hypocrisy, and so let's just come together on that and say, well, what is it we really want to see happen?
There you go.
What is the bottom line objective of what all this is about? And I'll tell you what, we could sit down with a room full of Republican-leaning, anti-government folks, conservative people, or at least in their minds conservative, because they're against the government. That's their definition of conservative.
Right.
And I think we could begin saying, well, what is it we want to see for our kids, for our grandkids? And I bet you we would be in absolute agreement.
I think you would.
Then the question is, well, how can we get there? We can't get there by button heads and with extreme polarization.
Right.
That doesn't work.
Right.
So, therefore, what can we do differently? The definition of insanity is to just keep doing what we're doing, button heads, and expecting results and getting nowhere. Well, that's what we keep doing. We can't keep doing that if we actually want to achieve something. Right. And what is it we want to achieve? So let's agree on that, and then work backwards from that.
Right. Can you imagine what it would be like to actually clean up the Mississippi River so that it was like a fish, like it was like in Mark Twain's day?
Oh my Lord!
Where you could run a trot line and have a week's worth of fish in 45 minutes.
Incredible.
To have the Louisiana marshes restored to their original productivity.
Oh, my Lord!
I mean, you're talking about huge.
How many levees and side dams are we breaching in order to accomplish that?
Right. And how many?
Not to mention,
and how many incentives? Like, how much more federal flood insurance money are we going to lose? In spite of this, and but I was thinking of it boggles my mind to what we have.
Right.
Like we were talking about yesterday, we probably, if you're an American today who loves to hunt and fish or likes to hike around, you're probably living in the greatest time in history.
Yeah, I would probably back it up about a decade or two, but yeah.
Because of that's right.
Yeah, but I mean, there's 330 million of us. But in terms of the 111 million acres of designated wilderness. That's part of the public trust that we talked about. Part of our birthright, part of the legacy.
Yeah.
And it represents the highest quality with the least amount of human impact of our public land.
Yep.
So there's the gold standard right there, wilderness, big W. And then we have other gradations of protection and lack of protection.
Right.
So we look at this incredible gift. Yeah, 330 million of us. Each of us owns an acre or two, right?
Yeah.
Of public land.
Yeah, probably about almost 2.
Yeah, about almost 2 acres of public land is what each of us owns right now, diminishing by the day with an increasing population.
Right.
But it's our birthright, and no one's going to take it away from us. And so,
not without a fight.
Without one hell of a fight.
Yeah.
So it's our birthright. It's an integral part of our freedom. It's an integral part of who we are, of our self-identity, of our self-worth, and of what makes us distinctly American as opposed to someone from another more densely populated country that doesn't have public land,
right?
That doesn't have public much of anything,
right?
And where it's basically just total anarchy,
right?
And
or very much controlled,
or total control.
Yeah, right.
And if we lose the freedom of wilderness, we lose freedom.
Yeah.
And wilderness, ironically enough, represents less government intrusion, less control than anything that's outside of wilderness, where you've got more government control over quote-unquote management.
Right.
With wilderness, basically, it's just people management. That's all wilderness management is people management.
Right.
The land can take care of itself. And the more importantly, I think, than the Wilderness Act keeps some things out, right, such as roads and clear cuts. But more importantly is what it does in a proactive way, and that is to nurture and protect and permit natural processes. Mm-hmm. The natural processes, like wildfire, are what mold the wilderness and create the evolutionary succession of plants and therefore wildlife and the scenery, everything about it.
Right.
Interconnectedness with watersheds and river quality, water quality, and so on. All that quality emanates from natural processes that humans have the wisdom and foresight to back off and allow to operate as much as possible.
Right, and which will all operate on you, should you choose to go there and mess up.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
I was telling you when I dumped
That's
that.
Right.
I dumped that inflatable, in the South Fork of the Shoshone.
Yes.
And all of a sudden I was just.
You were over your head.
Boy, was
Maybe
I
you're under the water too.
Underwater over my head and heading into that class 3.
Yeah.
And I was
saying,
like,
what am I doing here?
I had the freedom to fail.
You did. You had the freedom to die.
I did.
And to die on your own terms.
Yeah.
Well,
for
maybe
sure.
Not your own terms, but
I wouldn't have chosen it that day, but I was already in the river. But it was definitely the freedom to fail, buddy.
That's it.
Yeah.
And one thing about it, Hal, had that happened, at least you would not have been run over by a Winnebago in a McDonald's parking lot.
Correct. So, you're 3/4 of a century old.
I am beyond 77.
Gotcha. Okay.
I just turned 77.
Wow.
That makes me what's known as an old bastard.
Yeah. Well, you're still amazingly nimble in the high country.
Is the word spry?
Spry? Yeah, it's overused.
Yeah, he's a spry old guy.
He's a spry old guy. So, what's your?
I can still wander around a little bit.
Yeah, what's your? I would say, what's your goal?
Well, my goal and my exit plan. You mean?
Well, I would do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully, you'll put that off for a little while.
Yeah. Well, my exit plan is to be shot by a jealous husband at the age of 106 on top of Ear Mountain.
And he's going to have to be really spry.
He's going to have to be.
He's going to have to be spry, both to get up there and to get you.
He's going to have to get up on top Ear Mountain where I'm at.
Right, gotcha. Well, Bill, I'll leave it at that. Someday, we've touched on a lot of things here that would really go well for maybe another podcast.
I'd absolutely love to do it.
So,
anytime.
The philosophy here and the politics is something you really spent decades looking at and really kind of embodying.
Well, I appreciate that, and I need to get my thoughts a little more coherent and write a book.
You do. And I would be blown away if that book were 150 40 pages max. Like if you could burn this into that small stone tablet.
Yeah,
would be incredible.
Short and sweet.
Yeah, and you've done guidebooks. You've written. I was telling, and I know we got to go, but I was on a snow survey, and the conditions were terrible. We could only travel in the very early morning.
Yeah.
And I was laid up in a cabin, and there was a stack of Bugle magazines, and I found some of my old work in them. But there was all kind of your stories from the 90s.
Oh yeah, going back into even the 80s probably. Yeah.
There was a lot of Bill Cunningham available in the under the mouse turds.
Yeah, well, that's probably where most of it is.
They were towed around by the pack rats and shat upon, but there was a lot of Bill Cunningham there.
Well, it makes a good fire starter anyway,
yeah,
right?
For
you
sure.
Got the old wood stove going.
It did, and it whiled away the hours.
Yeah, oh, good.
I'll see you, man.
All right. Thank you, Hal.
Yes, sir.
Real pleasure. Thank
yes, and equally. Hey, this has been Backcountry Hunters and Anglers Podcast and Blast. I'm Hal Herring. We're signing off for this one, but we'll be back in a week or 10 days. And meantime, check out backcountryhunters.org. Get some more podcasts there and see what we're up to. And also, I'm going to be out there wandering around hunting and fishing, wearing out a pair of boots. And I hope you'll be doing the same thing. We're living in God's pocket, and we need to celebrate that. Never forget it. And get out there and live it and enjoy it. Hey, thanks a lot, everybody. Talk soon.